Broadcasting on the internet airwaves from the great state of Minnesota. My name is Shaun, and you're listening to The Shaun Tabatt Show. Today, my special guest is Vance Christie, and we're going to discuss his brand new book, which is titled Andrew Murray, Christ's Anointed Minister to South Africa, and that's the latest addition to the History Makers series, which is published by my friends over at Christian Focus Publications. Vance, welcome back to the show.
Well, thank you, Shaun. Great to chat with you again.
Now, you and I have met at a number of occasions. We've interviewed before on my previous show, but not all of my new listeners are going to be familiar with you or have had the pleasure of meeting you yet. So why don't we start off by having you take a few moments and introduce yourself to the audience?
I'll start by chatting about my family. My wife, Lita, has been my great joy in life for 35 years now. We have 3 adult daughters, 2 sons-in-law, no grandkids yet, although my wife is anxious for that addition. I have pastored for, I'm in my 30th year of pastoring now, and 18 of those years, most recently, have been at the Aurora Evangelical Free Church. And very much on the side, I have the opportunity to do some writing, and the Lord has blessed me in publishing a number of books in the field of historic Christian biography.
Well, thanks for helping us to get a bit of context for who you are and a bit about your work and your family. So your new book covers the life of Andrew Murray, and honestly, until you and I started talking about this past year, I hadn't thought a whole lot or knew a whole lot about Andrew Murray, so I'm excited to get into this today. I know I'm going to be learning some things as we go along. Would love to get a bit of the backstory, as I like to call it, the story behind the book. Curious how you got into a place where you decided one day, hey, I should write a book about Andrew Murray, and why do you think that it's important that a new biography be written about him at this time?
Well, Christian Focus graciously approached me to see if I might be interested in writing a book about Murray, and I had just a tiny bit of familiarity with him because as a boy growing up, I used to see some books by Andrew Murray in my dad's library. And then when I was in college, I read Murray's devotional classic, With Christ in the School of Prayer. But when Christian Focus approached me, I quick purchased a couple of the earlier biographies that have been written about his life. And as I read through those, I right away began to see that his was an extremely significant life and ministry that would be very worthy of promoting to contemporary Christians. There have been 3 previous major biographies written on his life. And the first 2 were 85 to 95 years ago, and then the most recent one was 35 years back. So it's really been a generation since a full account of his life has been written. And also, I've just come to realize that a lot of people, a number of people perhaps I should say, are familiar with Andrew Murray's books and they appreciate his writings, but his own writings tell us almost nothing about himself. So I just thought that a new biography would be a great way for people to learn about the minister who was behind all those great devotional classics that have been written.
Well, and that's a good segue into my next question. I would love for you to take us a bit deeper into who Andrew Murray was. Tell us about the time period that he lived in and where was his primary place of ministry?
Andrew Murray was probably the most prominent and influential pastor, devotional writer, and church leader ever to come out of South Africa. So he was just this extremely significant individual in his own day. He lived from 1828 to 1917, so lived a nice long life of 88 years. He was born in South Africa and spent his first 10 years there. And then he was sent overseas to Scotland and Holland to pursue his secondary, university, and theological education. And then he returned to South Africa, where he spent the remainder of his life, was an active Christian minister for 67 years, served mainly there in South Africa, almost exclusively. But then he also had some preaching tours to Europe and North America in those years as well.
You know, a lot of times as we look at historical figures and folks from church history, we can often identify what you might call a key focus. You know, what were they all about? Tell us a bit about what you see Andrew Murray's life showing as his key ministry focuses.
Well, it's kind of challenging to summarize his ministry succinctly because it truly was so multifaceted. But he did spend 57 years full-time pastoring of 4 different congregations. He was at his last church for 35 years. In addition to pastoring, while pastoring, he served as the moderator of his denomination, which was the Dutch Reformed Church of Cape Colony. He was the moderator for that denomination 6 different terms that totaled over 25 years of service in that capacity. So he was this visionary denominational leader. He helped to found a number of educational institutions for young people of all socioeconomic classes to help them get their education. Back in that day, it was kind of rare for girls to have good educational opportunities, so he founded schools that would help not only boys but also girls to receive an education. And these were primary, secondary, and college level schools, and the more advanced schools helped to train school teachers and future missionaries. He was also involved in helping to form foreign mission societies that were taking the gospel to unreached tribal groups. He himself carried out 9 major evangelistic tours to evangelize European settlers throughout South Africa. He supported numerous student ministries as well as home mission agencies that ministered to military personnel, the underprivileged classes, to moral outcasts in their society. He also led the Higher Life movement in South Africa, which emphasized holiness and consecrated Christian service. And in addition to all that, he was a prolific writer. He wrote over 70 full-length books. So I think you see why I say he's hard to categorize, because his ministry just had so many different facets to it.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that people often find surprising as we look at some of these key men and women throughout church history, and we consider the volume of work they completed in their lifetime, you know, be it the number of books they wrote, the number of, you know, evangelistic crusades they did, the ways they served people, served the church. I think we're often amazed by it in the sense that we feel like we're so technologically advanced and ahead of, you know, people from, say, 50 or 100 years ago. Yet there are these men and women of the past who often achieved, you know, 10, 50, 100 times more than a lot of us will in our lifetime. And it's kind of mind-boggling for us here in this quote-unquote modern age that they were able to do everything they did without all of our modern conveniences.
It really is, and I think that they were distracted by less than we are with some of our modern technologies and conveniences.
That's very, very true. I think if we all had $1 for every time we saw somebody out in public staring down at a phone and not paying attention, we could stop working and just retire. Problem of our age, I think you might call it.
Yeah.
Another thing that was very key in Andrew Murray's life was Christian service. I would love to hear a bit about, you know, what are some of the key characteristics of his service for Christ, and what example does that have for us?
One thing that stands out so clearly is that Andrew Murray actively served Christ all through his adult life and clear to the end of life. As I mentioned, he served 57 years as a full-time pastor while carrying out all those other ministries that I mentioned a few moments ago. And then after he retired at age 78, you would think he would be, about wound down by then. But he went on for a decade beyond that, the final decade of his life. He went right on speaking and carrying out writing ministries. And he did all this despite the fact that he had been involved in a series of cart accidents throughout his itinerating career where, like a horse-drawn cart or wagon that he was in, on 3 different occasions, pitched over and he was thrown out. And those accidents actually left him partially crippled in his latter decades of life. He also was battling going progressively deaf. He was completely deaf by the end of his life. And really from the time he was a young man, he had a neurological disorder that made writing very difficult for him throughout his life. But despite all those challenges, he just actively served Christ. And then something else that really impresses me about Murray's ministry was that he was strategic and responsive in his ministries. And what I mean by that was that he would see a need, like the need for educational institutions or the need for foreign missions or other spiritual needs, and he would respond to help meet that need himself. Plus, as a denominational leader, he would recruit many others to help address that need. And his example in that regard reminds me of the example of Christ in the end of Matthew chapter 9 and the beginning of chapter 10, where Jesus sees the shepherdless multitudes and he's moved by their needs. So he calls his disciples to start praying that the Lord would send out workers into the harvest field. And then there at the beginning of chapter 10, Jesus says, "Oh, and by the way, some of you are going to be the answer to this prayer request that you've been making." And he sends out the apostles to go help meet the need. So I see that same pattern of seeing a need and responding to meet it, being very strategic. And I think that very much characterized Andrew Murray's years of ministry.
And what a great testament to, even in the midst of difficulties, God can still use us in our retirement years. One of the concerns I see with people my parents' age and those that are coming up on retirement is so many people have decided they are just going to retire, they're not going to work anymore, and they're just going to do whatever they want, have fun, play golf, go fishing, whatever all day. And while I think it's certainly great to, have fun before retirement and in retirement, people have so much wisdom to share and so many ways that they can bless and serve that it breaks my heart when people aren't pursuing a high level of service, even in those retirement years. So what a great example Andrew Murray is for us in exactly that.
I totally agree. I think we see prominent Christian leaders today also who continue to be active late into their retirement years. I'm thinking of men like Chuck Swindoll or, men of that caliber, and many others could be named. And I think those of us with lesser abilities might think, well, it won't matter so much if I coast a little in my latter years. But as you just mentioned, so much is lost for the cause of Christ if Christians start just coasting in retirement. They still have so much to offer for Christ's kingdom work during those latter years.
Another thing that I'm guessing was very key in Andrew Murray's life was his personal spiritual life. Would love for you to tell us a bit about that, because I'm thinking that's probably going to be one of the things that was key in allowing him to do all the things that he did and finish so strongly, even in the latter part of his life.
Yes, absolutely. While Murray was a man of seemingly constant action, he also was a deeply contemplative individual. He was keenly interested in what was going on in the world all around him, but he consistently lived with a preoccupation with spiritual matters. He was a man of great prayer. He was very devoted to having a daily season of personal prayer, but then he also prayed without ceasing as he went through his daily activities, in that he wove prayer all through those activities, whether he was preparing a message or writing a chapter of one of his current books, or he was counseling an individual. Time and again, people witnessed him including prayer in those daily activities. He also published nearly 240 works of various lengths, including, as I mentioned earlier, over 70 books. And nearly all of those publications reflect the spiritual matters that he was constantly thinking and teaching about. He did write on a variety of subjects, but what's amazing to me is that he wrote several books each on the topics of prayer and holy living and the Holy Spirit. And you simply don't write several books on subjects like that unless you are constantly thinking about those subjects. So I think even his writings show how obviously absorbed his thinking was in spiritual matters.
From an application perspective, as Christians, as we're reading about a man like Andrew Murray, what can we learn from his examples? How could we choose to maybe modify how we're living based on what we see in his life?
Well, the great reminder to me through Murray's example is that healthy Christian living involves a full measure of both work for the Lord on the one hand and communion with Him on the other hand. And I think our primary means of communion would be through study and reflection on His Word, and through our communicating with Him through ongoing prayer. And I think that kind of communion motivates us and guides us and strengthens us in our service of Christ. And when that kind of communion is absent, then that motivation and strength for service has a way of running low on us. And I haven't conducted any surveys to verify this, but it seems to me that most modern American Christians are more prone to active Christian service than they are to contemplative communion. We like to be out there and busy and doing things for the Lord. And of course, that's vitally important, but we will be stronger and deeper and I think more effective in our service for the Lord if we're also maintaining a healthy balance of communion with Him. And if I could just mention a couple examples from the life of Christ. In Luke chapter 4, verses 15 and 16, it says that more and more people kept coming to Christ to be ministered to. But then it says, but He often withdrew to secluded places to pray. And that has often struck me, that while faced with the pressures of ministry, Jesus often withdrew to secluded places to have communion with His Father. And then in Mark 3:14, Jesus appointed 12 apostles, and the text says that they might be with Him and that He might send them out to preach. And I think there we see both sides of the emphasis that are needed in our life. The emphasis on spending time with Christ and then going out to serve Him.
Well, and the one thing that I'm always struck by when I hear people talk about Jesus going to secluded places to pray, if that was important in Jesus' own life, then how much more important is that important in my life and in your life? I think we kind of approach our spiritual matters often what I would call with like a microwave perspective or an instant perspective, where we're looking for the 5-minute devotion or that sort of a thing. And the whole idea of spending an extended time in Bible reading, prayer, that sort of thing, it almost seems like a thing of a different era, but it's just as vitally important today as it was 100, 200, 1,000 years ago.
Yes. And I think what we see in the example of Christ is that he wanted that kind of communion with his Father. It wasn't just something that he was checking off his to-do list to fulfill what he should be doing, but he wanted and he sensed his need for that kind of communion. And certainly, if that was his desire and his need, then it's all the greater need for us today.
Well, now let's dive a little bit deeper. Would love to hear a bit more about Andrew Murray's preaching ministry. Clearly, that was a prominent part of his life.
Well, it really was. Starting from when he just began ministering in his early 20s and clear through his life well into his 80s, when he preached, he was apparently such a remarkable preacher that he grew large crowds. Hundreds of people would come, sometimes thousands of people, to hear him preach. And once he became a prominent individual, he was a keynote speaker at numerous Christian conferences in South Africa. He also traveled to Europe and America. And in all those settings, he spoke not only at individual church services, but he spoke at missions conferences, student conferences, higher life conferences. So he was a prominent conference speaker in his day. And I think besides his deep spirituality, what people appear to have been especially gripped by was his incredible fervency or intensity in his preaching ministry. And if I could share just an example or two of that, in 1895, at 67 years of age, Andrew Murray was over in Britain to carry out a ministry tour there. And another pastor named Henry Taylor, who was actually a Presbyterian minister, introduced Andrew Murray to the British public through an article that he wrote for a publication about Murray. And here's what Taylor said about Murray's preaching. When preaching or conducting a service, his whole being is thrown into the task, and he glows with a fervency of spirit which it seems impossible for human flesh to sustain. At times he startles and overwhelms the listeners. Earnestness and power of the electric sort stream from him and affect alike the large audience or the quiet circle gathered round him. In his slight, spent frame of middle height, he carries in repose a volcanic energy which, when he is roused, bursts its barriers and sweeps all before it. I think, wow, that's an awfully earnest description of a fellow who at that time was well into his 60s in his preaching ministry. And then that sort of earnestness just continued to typify his preaching through 20 more years of ministry, even after that time.
Well, I'm hard-pressed to think of many preachers or speakers today who I would give that kind of a description of. I think that really is quite telling about why he drew such crowds. If that's how he was up on the stage as he was preaching and sharing, I mean, it must have been something to behold.
Yes, I believe so. And indications are that he had such incredible intensity that some people in interacting with him personally found it a bit intimidating until they got to sense his heart and his concern for them. And then they were just drawn in by that incredible intensity rather than, being a little affrighted by it.
Well, I think one of the places, when it comes to modern readers and especially readers here in the States, and you've already indicated this a bit, probably the one place that we're going to have encountered Andrew Murray is most likely some of his devotional writings. I work for Bethany House, and we publish a number of different selections of his writing, and I know other publishers do as well. Tell us a bit more about Andrew Murray's writing ministry.
Well, as I've mentioned, he published nearly 240 works of various lengths, including over 70 books. And his reading, like his preaching, was thoroughly scriptural. It was devotional and practical in nature. He really didn't write for a scholarly or academic audience. Instead, he was aiming at strengthening individuals and families spiritually, and also aiming at strengthening and advancing Christ's kingdom work. I think that's why Murray preached and why he wrote, to strengthen individuals, to strengthen families, to help advance Christ's kingdom work. And his works in his lifetime were published around the world in several different languages, and literally dozens of his titles are still published and read with benefit and with appreciation clear down to our own day, almost 100 years after his death. I was in a Christian bookstore when I was trying to figure out if I would write this, if I would take on this Andrew Murray biography project, and without telling the store manager why I was asking him, I just asked him if they carried any Andrew Murray titles. And the bookstore owner immediately said, "Oh, yes, we carry several of his titles because there continues to be significant interest in his writings." And then after I had made the decision to write the book, a lady from our church happened to ask what project I was working on presently. And when I said an Andrew Murray biography, she said, "Andrew Murray? He's one of our favorites. We've used several of his books in our family devotions." So, those are just a couple instances that I have heard of his writings being very popular still today.
So you spent, I'm guessing, the better part of, a year and a half working on, researching, learning about the life of Andrew Murray, as an author, as a pastor. As you look back on his life, what are the things that really impress you most?
Well, two things beyond everything else that we chatted about really kept sticking out to me time and again as I considered his life and example. One thing that was very pronounced was he had a constant, very marked emphasis on Christian love and unity, promoting those. Just an example from his middle-age years of ministry. In 1872, he's 44 years old, and he has just come to Wellington, South Africa, and he will spend the next 35 years of his life there. Andrew Murray was a strong believer in temperance, and he promoted temperance principles. But he was in an interesting situation in coming to Wellington because the bulk of his congregation were grape farmers who produced wine. So here you have a minister emphasizing temperance in a congregation that is made up largely of wine producers. When he came to Wellington, there were a lot of taverns in town, including 7 on the street that led up to the church where he pastored. So Murray, in emphasizing temperance, he led a movement in getting a number of taverns closed in town. In fact, Wellington, throughout most of his ministry, had only 4 taverns, and that was compared to a neighboring town that had 40 taverns. And we're talking towns of, just several thousand people. So you can imagine 40 taverns in a town of 5,000 or 6,000 people. We've probably got a little bit of a drinking issue going on there. Excessive. But not all his parishioners appreciated this emphasis on temperance. And in fact, one of his congregants came up to him and said, "Mr. Murray, the congregation will be torn apart by your temperance sentiments." And Murray calmly responded by saying, "Never. We will, if necessary, take the scissors of love and cut it in two, having one section for temperance and the other not, but we will live together in love." And that's what he did for the next 35 years. He promoted love and unity in a town and in a congregation that could have been deeply divided over that particular issue. And that was just one instance in his congregation. We could cite others of how he promoted love and unity there. And also among different people groups, he promoted unity, sought to promote unity, and among believers to promote Christian love. He grew up in a country where the primary European settlers were Dutch and British. And the Dutch and British did not get along often. And in fact, that division between those two people groups led to major wars called the Boer Wars. But Murray, through all his decades of ministry, sought to be a peacemaker between the British and the Dutch. He sought to pull Christians from those two ethnic groupings. He sought to pull them together in Christian love to maintain Christian unity. So that was just a huge emphasis throughout his ministry. Another thing that really impressed me about Andrew Murray was his incredibly consistent spiritual character, not only in public, but also in the privacy of his own home. He once, for a period of about 7 years during his 30s and 40s, he was one of 3 co-pastors of a very large parish in Cape Town, which was the capital city of Cape Colony during his life. In this parish, in the metropolis, they had 3 pastors who were caring for 5,000 attendees of their 2 churches in that parish. So every Sunday, Murray was preaching to thousands of people. He also preached 2 or 3 times during the week to students and poor underclassed individuals. He carried out active pastoral visitation. He was a denominational leader at a time where they were battling theological liberalism. He and his wife, Emma, at that time had 8 children of their own, plus they would have other young people who would come to live with them for a time so that those young people could pursue their education there in Cape Town. And one of the young people who lived with the Murrays for a period was a boy named Frederick Colby. He was the son of a missionary who came to live with the Murrays and get his education. And here's what Colby wrote about Murray during that period of his life. He says, "That was the time I saw Andrew Murray at the closest possible quarters. I may have been shy, but I certainly was observant. He was a very highly strung man. His preaching was so enthusiastic, his gestures so unrestrained, that he was wearing himself out, and the doctor ordered him to sit while preaching. So he had a special stool made for his pulpit in order to obey the doctor without letting everybody know." And Colby continues here, "Now such an output of nervous energy, and he was a frequent preacher, might well mean some reaction at home, some irritation with his wife, some unevenness toward his children, some caprice toward the stranger within his gates. But no, I never saw him thrown off balance. His harmony with Mrs. Murray was perhaps easy. She was such a gracious, wifely, motherly person that not to be in harmony with her would itself be self-condemnation. But he never did condemn himself. He was solid gold all through. And what I think is so impressive about Colby's testimony of Murray's pleasantness, even in the privacy of his own home, was those were years for Murray of incredible ministry problems and pressures. And yet, despite all that pressure, not only in public, but when he was at home, he was just perfectly even and consistent with how he treated others. And I think that just displays this remarkably consistent spiritual character that I admire, and I say, Lord, by your grace, I would like to be that way as well. I would like to exhibit that kind of consistency.
Yeah, I think definitely somebody who most of us would agree led a life that was well lived and just finished very strong and very well. There's a lot that we could take from his life and implement in our own, probably much for our betterment.
Absolutely. And I would be delighted if people would have their interest piqued and would choose to read this book on Andrew Murray's life. I think that they would find a great deal of not only interesting facts about his life, but personal spiritual benefit and challenge through his example.
I would agree with you there. If folks are interested in checking out your book and finding out more, there's a lot of places you can pick this one up. Yeah, you can find it at Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com. I'm sure it's available at CBD as well. Pretty much anywhere that your favorite Christian books are sold, you're going to see Vance's books there, and this one in particular, as it's just hot off the presses. Vance, if the listeners want to find out more about you, find out more about all of your books, where's the best place for them to find you on the web?
Well, with your help, Shaun, 2 or 3 years ago, we set up a website, simply VanceChristie.com, and that will lead them to information about myself and, more importantly, the books about prominent men and women of faith that I've had the opportunity to write through the past several years. And
for this book and for Vance's website and his Facebook profile, I'll be sure to include links in the show notes for this episode, which you'll be able to find at ShaunTabatt.com. If you just go ahead and type Vance's name, put Vance Christie in the search box on the website, and that'll take you right to the page for this interview. And it's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation today with Vance Christie, talking about his new book, Andrew Murray, Christ's Anointed Minister to South Africa. For more on Vance and his new book, you can visit his website, which you'll be able to find at VanceChristie.com. And you can also visit the publisher's website, which you'll be able to find at ChristianFocus.com. Vance, I just want to say thanks so much for sharing with us today. It's always a great pleasure to speak with you.
Likewise, Shaun. Thanks so much for featuring the Andrew Murray book on one of your podcasts, and I have just so appreciated the significant ministries that I see you carrying out for the Lord. May His full blessing rest on your many endeavors to His glory.
And to that, I'll just say amen. And that's all for this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show. If you have a question, comment, or suggestion, you can connect with me via email using show@ShaunTabatt.com. Be sure to follow me on Twitter, where I go by the Twitter handle @STabatt. And if you enjoy the show, head on over to iTunes and leave us a review. Until next time, this is your host, Shaun Tabatt, signing off.